All right, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome. It's quite a change. All right, so today we're going to look at a really interesting and a fascinating application of quantum mechanics to biology. And this is such a fascinating account of something that has lived with many animals and plants for millions of years. And this is about the concept of magnetoreception. All right, so let me propose the idea here. There are certain animals, notably birds, who migrate every year from the northern hemisphere, the upper parts of the northern hemisphere, to warmer latitudes during winters. And then they do this every year and they retrace their path back to their original homelands. And it happens with butterflies, it happens with sea turtles, it happens with robins, all kinds of birds, migratory birds. Now, the question which has baffled many scientists and investigators for very long is, how do these animals find their route? And why do they so accurately, and how do they so accurately determine their courses over the globe? Now, the answer to this question has baffled many scientists for many years. But now we do know that this is one of the most beautiful applications of quantum mechanics. It's ingrained in the biology, in the anatomy, in the molecular structure of these animals, and it has been there for millions of years. So in order to describe this and see how quantum mechanics can really affect such a warm system, which is the animal body, such a big system, a macroscopic system, which is the animal body, it takes a bit of a background. So let me build that background first. I already introduced quantum mechanics in the previous lecture, and I gave the important characteristics, the salient features of quantum mechanics in a 1 hour long lecture. So we're going to build upon that idea today. So the first thing that I would like to mention is that, remember that in the previous lecture, we talked about a photon and the photon taking two possible paths through a beam splitter. So here we are using the path of a photon as our quantum variable. More precisely, this is called a quantum degree of freedom. There could be other degrees of freedom as well. And what is relevant for the concept of magnetoreception is the concept of the spin degree of freedom. So subatomic particles have spins. And the most important subatomic particle that could be relevant for a biochemical process is an electron, right? Because chemical reactions are based upon the transfer of electrons in most cases. So generally, we talk about the charge of an electron. So when we study chemical reactions, be it biochemical reactions that take place inside the body, we are dealing with the transfer of charge. But the electron, a subatomic particle, a quantum particle, may have charge, but it also has another property that is called spin. A spin is the angular momentum of an electron. All right. And we know that the electron has a property called the spin quantum number. And for electron, this value is 1/2. So the electron is a spin half particle. Now, generally, we talk about the electron in our cartoonic representations, we represent electrons by these spheres, and we assume that they are rotating about their axis or spinning about their axis. So this could be clockwise rotation or anti-clockwise rotation. And with the as a result of this rotation, there is an angular momentum vector S. If the rotation is, if you view from the top anti-clockwise in this direction, you will have a vector of this kind. Otherwise, you will have a vector that is pointing downwards. But this is only a classical picture. And do not be swayed by this caricature, but the electron, just like it possesses mass, it possesses charge, it has this angular momentum. All right. And since S equals 2, half, sorry, the spin half particle, there are two possible orientations of this angular momentum. All right. A particle that has spin 1 has three possible orientations. So an electron, generally in physics, we call this to be a fermion. A fermion is a particle that has an integral that has a spin which is 1/2, 3/2, 5/2, 7/2, and so on. So the electron is a fermion. Since it has spin half, it has these two possible orientations of the spin angular momentum. And how do we know that the electron has spin? We can do an experiment very similar to a photon. So, and this experiment was performed in 1932. If you have a magnetic field, and you have a stream of electrons coming through this magnetic field, transfers to the magnetic field, and the magnetic field is inhomogeneous, then you would notice that this beam of electrons will split up into two beams. This is an experiment that you might have already seen in your modern physics class. So a stream of electrons going through an inhomogeneous magnetic field is split up into two. And the reason for this is that since the electron has a spin half, this angular momentum gives a magnetic moment to the electron. It renders the electron to become a tiny magnet. Just imagine a loop of charge. So you have a loop of charge going around, round and around and around. Could be an electron. Now you would know that this loop of charge acts like a tiny magnet. If this were a negatively charged particle, then this magnetic moment would be pointing in the downward direction. So this small loop of wire can be envisaged to be a tiny magnet with a north pole and a south pole. So every angular momentum renders that quantum object a magnetic property as well. All right. So this object is called a magnetic dipole. So if we had an electron and the electron had two orientations of spin opposite to one another, then this means that the electron would act like a tiny dipole magnet in which the magnet could either be up or down. And when this magnet, this tiny magnet, which is the electron, passes through an inhomogeneous magnetic field, a force acts on it. And that force splits up the two kinds of magnets into two beams. So the idea is that the spin has that the electron has a spin, it has a spin angular momentum. Any object that has a spin acts like a tiny magnet. And how do you know that the spin is 1/2? Because if you were to pass these electrons through an inhomogeneous magnetic field, it will split up into two beams. Right? If the spin were 0, then this beam would have gone undeflected. This experiment, by the way, is called the Stern-Gerlach experiment. So the electron has spin. which is a quantum mechanical property. And the spin could point up or it could point down. In this case, that is the path of a photon, we labeled the two paths as ket 0 and ket 1. Our degree of freedom was the path of the photon. Now, if you're not talking about photons, rather we talk about electrons, we can associate a quantum state to the electron spin. So one kind of state could be the spin pointing up, and we could represent this by an upward pointing arrow and put this inside ket, inside the symbol ket. Or we could have, sorry, ket spin pointing down. So these are two quantum states of an electron. And we can have an overall quantum state psi, which is a superposition of the two states, spin up and spin down. Just as we had a superposition of the path of a photon. In a totally analogous fashion, we can have superposition of spin up and spin down states. Right? So this is a superposition. All right. So the spin does not generally feature in biological processes or chemical processes because it's mostly the charge of the electron that plays an important role. When you talk about bonding, be it atomic bonding or molecular bonding, you're generally talking about charge. However, there is one phenomenon which involves spin and which becomes really important in bonding. There's a principle that you've all come across which invokes the idea of a spin. Can you recall what that principle is? So when you're building the periodic table and you're looking at the electronic configuration, you did take into account the spin of the electron. So there was one principle that directly dealt with the spin of an electron. What was that principle? That's the Pauli principle, the Pauli exclusion principle. Now, how does Pauli exclusion principle come into the picture? In order to talk about the Pauli exclusion principle, we need to talk about two spins, at least two spins. All right. So when we have two electrons that we are focusing our attention on, then we need to specify the quantum state of each electron. All right. Suppose I have two electrons, just representing them by these two spheres. Okay. Now it's possible that both of their spins are pointing in the same direction, both of them up. It's also possible that both of them are pointing in the downward direction. It's possible that one is pointing up and the other is pointing down. And there are two possibilities for this. So now we're talking about two electrons. Now, if you look at this configuration, I can represent this in quantum notation. So first electron, so on the left, I have the first electron and here I have the second electron. So I could write this as ket up, ket up. Okay. So this is just another way of writing this diagram in ket notation. This would become ket down, ket down, ket up, ket down, ket down, ket up. Okay. So this is just the ket notation for the four diagrams that I've drawn. Now, suppose I have two, say, imagine that I have two hydrogen atoms. and they form a bond. So the two electrons are being exchanged. So the electrons are sharing a molecular orbital. So the dihydrogen molecule is the sharing of two electrons in a covalent bond. Now those two electrons are inside an orbital. That's a molecular orbital. So if they were to be in this orbital, which means that they are sharing the same wave function, they have identical wave function, they are sharing the same space. In order to form the bond, which is called a sigma bond, their spins have to be opposite to one another. That's the Pauli exclusion principle. If two electrons share the same wave function, they have identical wave functions for their position, their orientation, which are called the three quantum numbers n, l, m, l. Then the fourth quantum number has to be different, which is the spin. So the spins have to point in the opposite direction. So if a bond were to be formed between these two hydrogen atoms, the two electrons must be in this opposite orientation. Correct? Otherwise, a bond will not be formed. But the Pauli exclusion principle has another variant, which is simply called the symmetrization postulate. What the symmetrization postulate means is that if you exchange two electrons, if you change the position of two electrons, you swap them, then the new wave function that is created has to be the negative of the original. All right, so let me write this in words. The symmetrization postulate, which is one form, the Pauli exclusion principle is a special case of the symmetrization postulate. The symmetrization postulate states that if two fermions are exchanged, which means they are swapped, then the new wave function is the inverse of the original. Now, this is a wave function, right? All of this is a wave function. Now, let's rewrite this wave function. Let's call this a candidate wave function. The candidate wave function is both spins pointing in the upward direction. All right. So if I were to exchange these particles, I do an exchange operation, which means this particle goes here and this particle goes here. Then what's going to happen is the wave function remains unchanged. All right. Similar would be the case for this wave function. Okay. So remember that this is just the spin wave function. And I'm going to come to this point in a minute. So is this wave function symmetric under exchange or asymmetric, or even under exchange or odd under exchange? Something, a wave function that does not change sign is called an even wave function. Something that reverses the sign is called an odd wave function. Is this even? Even. Even or odd? Even. What about this wave function? Odd? Now, if I were to take this wave function up, down, and I would put the exchange operation on this, I would get down, up. But is this the negative of the original? No, it's not. It's not. It's a new wave function altogether. It's not the negative of the original. All right. It's neither the negative nor the positive of the original. It's a new wave function. Right. So because we've changed, the first spin here is pointing up, the second spin pointing down. Here, the first spin is pointing down and the first spin, second spin pointing up. So, so here you have two electrons and you flip flopping the two spins. It's a new wave function. So this wave function is neither even nor odd. However, if I make a superposition of this kind, and I put an under root 2 with this just for normalization. Now, is this wave function even or odd? It's even. So if I swap this, this becomes down, up, up, down, which is the same as the original. So this is an example of an even wave function. What about this spin wave function? Is this even or odd? The last one. It's neither. So if I were to put a make a superposition in this form, put a minus sign, will this render this wave function to be even or odd? So this is my original. I exchange the operators. I exchange the spin labels. This becomes, so this goes here, comes up, down, minus, down, up. So this is just the negative of this thing, right? So this is an example of an odd spin wave function. So every wave function has to be even or odd in the ground state, right? Now, I'll come to the symmetrization postulate in a minute. So if you're talking about two electrons are two spins. And you might be wondering, what does this have to do with the biology? I'm going to come to that in a minute. So now we have two electrons and they have spin. Each electron has a spin. And those, just looking at the spin, forgetting about the angular momentum of the electron, because the electron has an orbital angular momentum as well, an L. It also has some principal quantum number, N. It also has some azimuthal quantum number, ML. We are forgetting all the other degrees of freedom. We're just focusing on the spin angular momentum, or simply the spin of an electron. And if you just to look at the spin wave function, we have these four possibilities, four even or odd possibilities. Three of them are even and one of them is odd. Now, this odd wave function is called a singlet. Singlet wave function, denoted by S naught, ket S naught. And these three kinds of wave functions, they are called triplets. Triplets. This wave function is called T naught. This wave function here is called T sorry, the top wave function is called T1. This wave function is called T minus 1, and this wave function can be called T naught. These are just labels. So we have a singlet state and three kinds of triplet states. All right. Now, what the symmetrization postulate means is that the new total wave function is the inverse of the original total wave function. The electron has different degrees of freedom. It has spin, it has other degrees of freedom, orbital angular momentum, and so on. It could move, it could vibrate if it's in a bond. So the overall wave function has to be odd. So this odd singlet wave function has to combine with an even wave function for the other things to make the overall wave function odd. But nevertheless, this is called a singlet wave function, and these three are the three different kinds of triplet wave functions. Generally, when you read books or literature, you don't take into account the superposition. You just mention that if the spins are opposite to one another, it's called a singlet, and if the spins are parallel to one another, it's called a triplet. All right. So, but that's just a sleuth of hand. That's just a hand waving argument. This is a proper quantum mechanical argument. The key is, remember the Pauli exclusion principle. If two electrons are in the same region of space, they share all other properties. They have identical properties. They have the same orbital angular momentum. They're located within the same region of space, which means that they are forming a sigma bond. Then their spins must be in the singlet state. They must be opposite to one another. All right. Okay, one question. If you look at these wave functions, the overall angular momentum of the singlet state is 0. Whereas for the triplet, this is 1. So if you are physics students, you know how to add angular momenta. Are there any physics students here? No, but okay, just forget about this. All right, so now let's come to the biology part slowly. Any questions? Now, I would like to introduce the concept of a radical. A radical is a molecule which has a lone electron. A molecule is something which generally has an even number of electrons. And when you have an even number of electrons, the electrons can pair up, and there is no unpaired electron left in the molecule, right? So when the electrons pair up, they pair up as singlets. Remember when you were building the periodic table, you paired up electrons. So first two electrons went into the same orbital and they carried opposite spins. And then you build up the periodic table. So if you have a molecule which has an even number of electrons, then all the electrons will be in the singlet state. And overall, the molecule will not have any spin because the spins are going to cancel. Spin half plus minus half, all of them are going to cancel out. Now, if you suppose I have a molecule A, and this molecule loses its electron, it donates its electron to something else. So now it will have an odd number of electrons. And there will be one electron that is unpaired, that is not paired up with anything else. So that single electron can be represented by a dot. Okay. And the molecule will now also acquire a positive charge because it has lost its electron. So this is an example of a radical. A radical is generally a charged molecule which has lost or gained an extra electron and which has one lone electron, okay, an unpaired electron. So suppose I start off with two molecules A and B. Two molecules, both of them carry even number of electrons. And A donates its electron to B. So A will become a radical and B will also become a radical, a negatively charged radical. Correct? All right. So now A and B are both within the same, they could be subcomponents of a protein, they could be different parts of the same protein, or a complex or a molecular complex in which A is one molecule and B is another molecule, both of them combined together in a complex. And A donates an electron to B. A and B become radicals. Both of them become charged, but each one of them exposes a lone electron now. Now this electron carries a spin. This spin will point in some direction, right? This spin will also point in some direction. Now, when you started off with a stable structure and everything, there were just even number of electrons, all the electrons were, if you paired up electrons, partitioned all the electrons into pairs, each pair would be a singlet state, correct? That's how you form a stable structure. Each pair would be in a singlet state. Now, when one of the electrons is being transferred to the other moiety inside the molecular complex, A is transferring its electron to B, then A and B each carry unpaired electrons, but they will conserve the spin. They will preserve this original spin on them. Now, there's a rule that in most organic reactions, the spin is conserved. Just as charge is conserved, mass is conserved, spin is also conserved. We generally don't talk about spin in chemical reactions because the effects are so small, and it's just a specialized branch of chemistry. But in an organic reaction, mostly spin is conserved, unless you have some magnetic ion or some heavy metal ion inside the molecule. Okay, spin is conserved. So if you started off with electrons being in the singlet state, so just imagine for the time being that in AB you had two electrons which were in the singlet state, opposite spins. Now this is just a hand waving way of writing S naught, get S naught. Now if I break apart these electrons, partition these electrons, one electron goes to A, spin up, this belongs to A, and the spin down belongs to B. So this correlation between the spins, this anti-correlation between the spins, one up, the other down, one down, the other up. This singlet character of the two electrons is preserved as the electron transfer takes place. Got it? So this complex remains a singlet. So now we have two electrons, two lone electrons, and they are in a quantum state, which is the singlet state. Let's call this S. Instead of S naught, let's just call it S. All right. So now you have created a pair of radicals. So this is a pair of radicals or a radical pair. Which starts off in a singlet state. And the quantum state of these two electrons will be ket S naught. which is one spin up, the other spin down. But for completeness, because you have to satisfy the symmetrization postulate, this could be a superposition. So you don't know whether the first spin is up or down. It's going to be a superposition. So this means the first spin is up, the second spin is down. But you could equally have the first spin down, the other spin up. So you create a superposition of these two states. And when you measure the wave function, this wave function, it collapses. You either get this with the probability of 1/2, or you get this with the probability of 1/2. It's like breaking the Schrodinger's, opening the Schrodinger's box and collapsing the wave function. So now you have created a pair of radicals in which the two electrons are in a singlet state. Any questions? What we would now like to do is, what does this have to do with the migration of birds? Now, if you look at the Earth, so the Earth has a magnetic North Pole and a magnetic South Pole. And this is due to the currents that are flowing inside the inner core of the Earth, perhaps. But whatever the cause of this terrestrial magnetic field, there is a weak magnetic field, really weak. So, and this magnetic field will have a certain direction. So at the North Pole, this is the magnetic North Pole, this is the magnetic South Pole. At the poles, the field is pointing towards the Earth. Right? Sorry. So if you were to make a plot of the Earth's field, this is what it will look like. So the Earth has a large magnetic field. Extends up to thousands of kilometers above the Earth. In fact, this is crucial for life on Earth, because if there were no magnetic field of the Earth, charged particles from the solar corona would bombard the planet Earth. In this case, they get trapped inside the magnetic fields and thus show helical motion around the Earth's magnetic field and don't penetrate or pierce the atmosphere. So this is a really important component of our biosphere, this terrestrial magnetic field, but it's a really small field. Now, if you notice at the poles, if you were standing at the pole, the magnetic field will be pointing straight down, vertically down. If you're at the equator, the magnetic field would be parallel to the surface. So at the North Pole, for example, the field will be pointing downwards. This is the magnetic field at the North Pole. At the equator, which is latitude 0 degrees, the field will be pointing parallel to the surface. At the South Pole, the field will again be pointing towards into the surface or out of the surface, sorry. In Lahore, for example, the latitude would be in the 30 degrees. The field points in this direction at an angle of roughly 50 degrees. This is Lahore. So if you hang a compass needle at different points on the Earth's surface, at the poles, it's going to point vertically downwards or upwards. At the equator, it's going to be flat, horizontal. At intermediate locations, it's going to show a certain inclination. Right? So this phenomenon is called inclination. Now, a bird uses the Earth's magnetic field in order to combine with light signals in order to traverse the surface of the Earth, right? And it uses deep quantum mechanics. And the quantum mechanics that it uses is, how do these spins that are created, the singlet state that is created within the pair of radicals, how does it correspond to magnetic fields? All right, so now I'm going to build this concept a bit further. I'm intentionally going really slow because there are lots of ideas that are combined here. All right, so the first idea is, now in one stroke, I've gone from one electron to two electrons. First of all, we're talking about a single electron. Now we're talking about two electrons because we have a pair of radicals. Now let's shift gears backwards a little bit and get back to looking at a single electron. If I had a single electron spin inside a magnetic field, remember that an electron spin is a tiny magnet. What's going to happen to this magnet? Just stay where it is, or something interesting is going to happen to it? A tiny magnet placed inside a magnetic field. It's going to align itself with the field. So if it's already aligned, it will stay there. If it's anti-aligned, it will flip back to the alignment position. What if is that transfers? It's transfers to the applied field. So the field is up, but you put a magnet here. What's going to happen to it? It's eventually going to align itself. But anything else, would anything else happen? It's just going to align like this. Just that's it. How does a motor work? How does a motor work? In a motor, there's a magnetic field. And then there's an armature. There's a coil winding that is rotating. So if I were to draw a motor, so let's choose this. In a motor, you have a magnet, magnetic field, and you have a coil. And this coil carries a current, right? Carries a current. So what happens to this coil? What's going to happen to the coil? It's going to rotate. Right, it's going to rotate. That's what happens inside a motor. This coil is generally called an armature. The armature rotates. It starts rotating. Why does it start rotating? Because this current carrying coil, I wind my fingers in the direction of the current. It's like a tiny magnet. The magnet in this case is pointing inwards, right? So I have a magnet, and a magnet has a magnetic dipole moment, just like an electric dipole moment. A magnet has an magnetic dipole moment mu, which is pointing inwards. You might remember from your school days that this mu is equal to the current times the area enclosed by this current carrying coil. So this is the magnetic moment. Now this magnetic moment is pointing inwards, and you have a magnetic field that is pointing in this direction, B. So B is like this from left to right, and the magnetic moment is inwards. What's going to happen is a torque is going to be produced. Now this torque is mu cross B. So this is my mu. This is my B. So I take the vector product of this mu and this B, I get a torque pointing downwards, which means that this coil is going to, so if this is the coil, it's going to go like this, right? So if you look from the top, This coil is going to turn around and around and around. A torque is produced, and that torque is given by mu crossed with B. So whenever you place a tiny dipole moment or a magnet or a spin or an electron inside a magnetic field, it's going to rotate. It's what is going to rotate? The magnetic moment is going to rotate. The spin is going to rotate. So if I start off with, suppose I have a magnetic field. This is my magnetic field pointing up. There is a possibility that my wave function is just up. I start off with this wave function. It's already aligned with the field. Nothing is going to happen. If I start with this this spin orientation, it will eventually align itself with the field because it wants to lower its energy, but it's not going to rotate. Because in this case, the magnetic moment is also parallel to the field, and mu cross B will be 0, right? So there will be no torque. B is up, mu is down. And why have I drawn mu in the opposite direction as the spin? Because we're talking about a negatively charged electron. Just so that you don't get confused, I have a loop and a positive charge is flowing in this direction. The angular momentum, so let's call the angular momentum L, is upwards. The magnetic moment is also upwards because the charge is in the same direction as the charge is positive. If I were to talk about an electron, if this were a negatively charged particle, an electron moving in the same direction, the angular momentum L is still pointing according to the mechanical motion of the electron, but now the magnetic moment is going to point in the opposite direction. Okay, so that's why here, if the spin angular momentum is pointing up, its magnetic moment is pointing down, but that's besides the point. So if I have the spin parallel or collinear with the field, it's not going to precess. It's not, no torque is going to act on it. However, if I start off with my spin pointing in this direction, which is the superposition of up and down, if I start off in a superposition state with the spin pointing in the horizontal direction, now what's going to happen? Will a torque act on this spin? Yes, a torque is going to act on the spin. And what this torque does is that the spin, now the spin is pointing in this direction, field is upward, the spin is going to precess certain frequency, right? You'll move with a certain frequency because the torque is going to act on it, right? So now this, so you start off by, I start off with ket up plus ket down. I'm going to precess. I'm going to rotate. I'm going to change the wave function. And all of this could be represented on a sphere. If I draw a sphere, and all of you should actually know about this sphere, it's called the Bloch sphere. And why would you know about this? Should know about this because it's all of quantum computing is based on it. So on the sphere, there are points, and each point corresponds to a quantum state. On the North Pole, you have ket up. On the South Pole, you have ket down. Here, you have up plus down. This is the equatorial line. At the back of this equatorial plane, at the diametrically opposite side, you have ket up minus ket down. So what happens in this case is that if a magnetic field is pointing up, this vector is going to precess in the equatorial plane. And it's going to change. It's going to oscillate between this state and this state continuously. So after some time, it's going to come here. So suppose after time capital T, it comes here. After time 2t, it comes back here. Okay. So it's going to oscillate between these two states. So this is just a single spin that we're talking about. By the way, all of this is the basis of the technique of NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance / MRI. And I've given numerous lectures on this. You can look them up on the web as well. All right, so this is about a single electron placed inside a magnetic field. And now what we have is a pair of electrons in a singlet state. Now, not talking about one electron, we're talking about two electrons in this state. So this pair of electrons in the radical pair sees a magnetic field. And that there are two kinds of magnetic fields that it sees. One is the Earth's magnetic field, which is our control variable here, because a bird needs to know which direction is it headed in if it were to know what the magnetic field is at a certain point on the Earth's surface. And the magnetic field is changing its inclination, right? Changing its inclination. So there has to be some mechanism inside the bird that helps it gauge the inclination of the Earth's magnetic field. And the idea lies in how does the singlet state for electrons in a radical pair correspond to the inclination of the Earth's magnetic field. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to carry this discussion in the next lecture. But the idea is that the bird, we're talking about birds here, must have a compass that tells the bird which path should it take. Very similar to the compass which human beings have used for about 5,000 years. The beauty of this is that this compass in most cases is a chemical compass. It's not a mechanical structure. It's a chemical compass. It comes out through a chemical reaction. That chemical reaction has its origin in the generation of this radical pair. And the neat thing is that this generation is photosensitive. When light falls on this molecule, of a certain wavelength, this excitation takes place, and A donates its electron to B and forms a radical pair, which is now in the singlet state, which is now seeing a particular magnetic field. And this singlet state is going to precess somehow, just as we've seen the precession of a single electron, it's going to precess into the triplet state at a certain frequency. And that frequency is going to depend upon the strength of the magnetic field imposed by the Earth and its inclination. And the amount of triplet formed gives another chemical reaction which opens and closes ion channels, and it gives a signal to the brain. Indirectly, this process is revealing what the inclination of the magnetic field is. So I've just summed up everything in these short sentences. I'm going to unravel most of this mathematically in the next lecture. But I would like to, before we go, any question, because this is really important. I've really gone slow here. Are there any questions that you would like to ask, or is it all right? All right. Thank you very much.